Long before the first city was named, before kings carved their victories into stone, something happened that should not have been possible. A world rose, mastered forces we still struggle to understand, and then vanished so completely that its memory survived only as whispers. Why do the oldest monuments on Earth seem to defy the tools of their supposed builders? Why do ancient maps show lands no human should have seen? Why do myths from opposite sides of the planet tell the same story, using the same symbols, the same warnings? And why does our version of history require us to believe that knowledge only moves forward, never falling, never breaking, never being erased? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The stone rises from the desert with a silence that feels deliberate, as if the structure itself is waiting for the right question. The Great Pyramid does not announce its purpose. It simply stands, massive and indifferent, its edges cutting the sky with a confidence that feels older than memory. Millions of people arrive each year, cameras raised, satisfied with the idea that they already know what this thing is. A tomb, a monument, a triumph of ancient determination. Yet the longer one looks, the harder it becomes to accept that explanation without discomfort settling in the chest. The scale alone resists familiarity. More than 2 million blocks, each weighing as much as a modern vehicle, stacked into a form so precise it still defines geometric perfection. This is not a vague pile of stones shaped into a triangle. This is a structure aligned to true north, with a deviation so small it challenges instruments built with satellites and lasers. True north here does not mean the wandering magnetic north that drifts over time like a confused compass needle, but the fixed axis of Earth itself, an invisible line around which the planet spins. To find it without modern tools requires a level of astronomical understanding that feels strangely out of place in the story we are told. The base spreads across tens of thousands of square meters, leveled so perfectly that the difference from one corner to another is measured in centimeters. Imagine pouring water across a surface the size of several football fields and watching it settle into a mirror-flat plane. That is the level of precision implied here. The explanation offered is simple tools, patient labor, and human will. Copper chisels, wooden sledges, rope and ramps. Yet simplicity begins to fracture when numbers are allowed to speak. Some of the stones used inside the pyramid are not limestone from nearby quarries, but granite hauled from Aswan, hundreds of kilometers away. Granite is not forgiving. It is crystalline, hard, resistant to cutting even with modern steel. Some of these blocks weigh as much as a battle tank. They are not roughly hacked. Their surfaces meet at angles so tight that even today a razor blade cannot slide between them. This is not the signature of brute force. It is the signature of control. The usual image shows lines of workers dragging stones across sand, chanting in rhythm, inching progress forward by suffering alone. Yet no ramp remains, not a fragment, not a foundation. To raise stones of such mass to heights exceeding 40 meters, a ramp would need to stretch for over a kilometer at a gentle slope, consuming more material than the pyramid itself. Such a structure would leave scars across the plateau. there are none. The desert remembers everything. Wind can erase footsteps, but it does not erase mountains of construction debris. Then there is the interior. The so-called King's Chamber is lined with granite fitted so precisely that the room behaves like a single resonant cavity. Above it, massive relieving chambers redistribute weight in a way that looks less like trial and error and more like calculated engineering. The granite sarcophagus inside is too large to have been brought through the finished corridors, implying it was placed during construction. Its surface is rough compared to the walls around it, an odd contrast that suggests urgency or a change in purpose rather than ceremonial perfection. No mummy was found, no inscription explaining its use, silence where answers should be. Measurements deepen the unease. The proportions of the pyramid encode relationships that mirror the geometry of the Earth itself. The perimeter relates to the planet's circumference. The slope reflects ratios later formalized in mathematics thousands of years afterward. This is not mysticism disguised as numbers. It is geometry embedded in stone, geometry that speaks the language of a planet rather than a dynasty. If this were an isolated anomaly, it might be dismissed as coincidence, but it is not alone. The two neighboring pyramids follow the same cardinal precision. Together they form a pattern that mirrors a celestial arrangement, echoing the belt stars of Orion as they appeared in a distant epoch, when the sky itself looked different due to the slow wobble of Earth's axis, a motion called precession that unfolds over nearly 26,000 years. Precession is not something discovered by watching the sky for a season or even a lifetime. It reveals itself only through long-term observation, through records kept across generations or inherited from an earlier source. The question shifts quietly at this point. It is no longer how the stones were lifted, but why such care was taken at all. Tombs do not require planetary alignment. Graves do not need millimeter accuracy across vast distances. A king seeking an afterlife does not need to encode the dimensions of the Earth into his resting place. These features serve another purpose, one that values permanence, precision, and communication across time. Consider what it means to build something meant to last tens of thousands of years, not just to impress contemporaries, but to speak to unknown observers far in the future. Stone becomes a medium, geometry becomes a language, and alignment becomes a timestamp written into the sky. This is not the behavior of a culture improvising with limited knowledge. It resembles the behavior of a culture preserving something it knows may be lost. The pyramid does not advertise a name. It does not boast of conquest. It does not glorify a ruler in text or image. It is strangely anonymous. That absence feels intentional, as if the builders were less concerned with being remembered as individuals and more concerned with ensuring that the message itself survived, even if their identity did not. Standing before it, the modern mind is caught between two discomforts: accept the official explanation and quietly ignore the inconsistencies, or accept that something essential is missing from the story. The stones do not argue. They simply remain, aligned with the planet, aligned with the stars, waiting for someone to stop asking how slaves dragged blocks through sand and start asking why knowledge of such depth appears fully formed at the dawn of recorded history. The pyramid does not feel like a beginning. It feels like a remainder. like the last intact sentence from a book whose earlier chapters were burned. It suggests that what we call the start of civilization may instead be a restart, a moment when survivors worked with fragments of understanding inherited from a time we no longer remember. If that is true, then the Great Pyramid is not a tomb at all. It is a marker, a signal anchored to earth and sky, declaring that someone was here before us, someone who understood the world in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Not all lost knowledge announces itself in stone. Some of it hides quietly, small enough to be dismissed, ordinary enough to be shelved and forgotten. In a museum drawer in Baghdad rests an object barely taller than a hand, a simple clay vessel stained by time. No inscriptions praise a king. No decoration marks it as sacred. For decades, it was catalogued as a ritual container, another mute fragment of a vanished culture. Then someone looked inside, and history quietly cracked. Within the clay sat a copper cylinder. Inside that, an iron rod, isolated by a plug of asphalt-like material. It was not decorative. It was functional. When filled with an acidic liquid, such as vinegar or fermented juice, the device produced a steady electric current, about 1.5 volts, the same output as a modern AA battery. This object, known today as the Baghdad Battery, predates Alessandro Volta by nearly 2,000 years. The reaction to this discovery was predictable. Reinterpretation followed denial, and denial softened into containment. The device, scholars said, was likely used for electroplating, a simple craft technique to coat jewelry with a thin layer of gold. The explanation was elegant, familiar, and safe. Electricity reduced to ornamentation. A novelty, not a system. But this explanation carries a quiet problem. No electroplated objects from that region and period have ever been found. Not one. Gold artifacts exist, yes, but their composition does not match electrochemical deposition. The technology is present, but its supposed products are absent. This is not how tools behave. Tools exist to serve a purpose. If the purpose leaves no trace, then perhaps it was not the real one. Electricity is not merely a convenience, it is a gateway. Even low voltage can stimulate nerves, cause muscle contraction, produce light under the right conditions, or trigger chemical reactions. When scaled through multiple units connected together, its effects multiply. One battery is curiosity, 100 is infrastructure. Ancient texts from China and the Mediterranean describe therapeutic shocks delivered to the body using fish or metal devices. Sensations described are unmistakably electrical. Pain relief, muscle response, healing attributed to invisible force. These are not metaphors. They are observations recorded by people who lacked the language to name what they were experiencing. Now consider the architecture again. Granite chambers with strange acoustic properties. Stone boxes cut with precision far beyond burial needs. Cavities that resonate at specific frequencies. Sound and electricity are not opposites. They are siblings, both expressions of vibration. Where sound moves air and stone, electricity moves charge. Both obey laws of frequency, amplitude, and resonance. A civilization that understood resonance deeply would not separate these forces as we do. It would see them as variations of the same principle. Control vibration, and you control matter. Control matter, and you control environment, structure, perhaps even biology. The battery suggests portability, energy not tied to fire or muscle. Quiet, contained, reusable. That alone redefines daily life. Lighting without smoke, medical stimulation without blades, instruments powered invisibly, tools that do not leave burn marks or soot. This may explain something long noted but rarely emphasized. Many ancient tombs and chambers show no evidence of torch use, no smoke residue, no scorched ceilings. If work was done inside them, it was done without flame. Electricity also implies measurement. Current must be regulated. Circuits must be closed. Metals must be selected for their properties, not their appearance. Copper conducts. Iron reacts. Asphalt insulates. These are not accidental discoveries. They require experimentation, observation, and memory. The unsettling implication is not that ancient people stumbled into electricity, but that they integrated it into a broader technological worldview, a worldview we no longer possess. When such systems collapse, their components scatter. A battery without its network becomes meaningless. A tool without its machine looks like a curiosity. The same pattern appears again and again. At Antikythera, bronze gears modeled celestial cycles with mechanical precision unmatched for over a millennium. This was not a toy. It was an analog computer, capable of predicting eclipses, planetary motion, even the timing of Olympic Games. Yet it appears suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, without ancestors or descendants. Technology does not leap. It climbs, except when it falls. The Antikythera mechanism required mathematical models of the heavens that assume predictability, regularity, and long-term observation. It encoded knowledge of lunar irregularities that were not formally described until Kepler. This is not coincidence, it is inheritance. The battery, the mechanism, the stones, the acoustics, these are not isolated miracles. They are fragments of a coherent system fractured by time. A system that did not survive intact, but whose echoes persist in places we were taught not to connect. If such a civilization existed, it would not leave behind factories in the modern sense. Its most advanced tools may have been small, modular, or biological. Knowledge stored in minds rather than manuals. Techniques passed through initiation rather than publication. When catastrophe came, these systems would not crumble neatly. They would vanish unevenly, leaving behind artifacts divorced from their context. This reframes the ancient world. It stops being a slow climb from ignorance and becomes a landscape shaped by loss. Periods of brilliance followed by silence. Survivors adapting fragments of old knowledge to new, harsher conditions. Stories replacing schematics. Ritual replacing procedure. The battery's simplicity is deceptive. It hints at a society comfortable with abstraction, with invisible forces, with power that does not announce itself in flame or noise. A society that may have preferred subtlety over spectacle, and subtle technologies leave subtle ruins. The question is no longer whether ancient people were clever. That has been settled beyond doubt. The question is whether we have misidentified the peak, whether what we call the dawn of civilization is actually the morning after something far older, more complex, and more fragile than we are willing to admit. If electricity was once known and then forgotten, if sound shaped stone and then faded into myth, if machines modeled the cosmos and then rusted into anonymity, then history is not a ladder. It is a waveform, rising, collapsing, rising again. The small clay jar does not shout, it whispers, and what it whispers is dangerous to comfortable timelines. It suggests that humanity has stood at this threshold before, holding forces it barely understood, confident in its mastery, unaware of how quickly knowledge can slip into legend. The battery doesn't prove everything, but it proves enough. Enough to make certainty impossible. Enough to demand that we stop asking why ancient people could not do these things and start asking why we are so certain that they did not. The sea has a way of preserving what land destroys. Salt corrodes, pressure crushes, time disfigures. Yet sometimes the ocean hides a truth so well that it waits centuries for the right eyes to see it. Near the small Greek island of Antikythera, sponge divers once descended into dark water, expecting nothing more than rock and silence. Instead, they surfaced with bronze statues, fragments of marble, and a corroded lump that looked like little more than scrap metal fused by decay. It was catalogued, stored, and nearly forgotten, another casualty of assumption. Years later, when that lump was examined with X-rays, the past revealed teeth. Inside the corroded mass was a machine, not symbolic, not decorative. A machine built with interlocking bronze gears, cut with a precision that should not have existed in its time. At least 37 gears, some smaller than a coin, arranged to transmit motion in complex ratios. This was not craftsmanship for art's sake. This was computation, an analog computer designed to predict the movements of the heavens. The mechanism could track the cycles of the moon, account for its irregular speed across the sky, predict eclipses years in advance, and synchronize solar years with lunar months. It even encoded the timing of athletic games held every 4 years, grounding celestial order in human ritual. This device compressed the sky into a box small enough to carry by hand. To build it required more than metalworking skill. It required astronomical data gathered over generations. It required mathematics capable of modeling cyclic time. It required a worldview that saw the universe not as divine chaos, but as a system governed by rules that could be measured, predicted, and replicated. This alone would be astonishing. But what unsettles historians is not what the mechanism does. It is what surrounds it, or rather what does not. No earlier prototypes have been found, no simpler model showing experimentation, no partial failures, no evolutionary trail leading up to this achievement. And after it sank with that ship, nothing comparable appears again for over 1,000 years. Medieval Europe's first astronomical clocks emerge in the 14th century, clumsy and imprecise by comparison. The Antikythera mechanism does not belong where it sits in time. It appears complete, then vanishes. Technology does not behave this way unless something interrupts it. Imagine discovering a modern laptop buried in a medieval village with no factories, no power grid, no written theory to support it. That is how this device sits in history. A fully realized expression of knowledge without context, without ancestry, without descendants. It is not the beginning of a tradition, it is the end of one. The inscriptions etched onto its plates reference cycles known today by names such as the Metonic cycle, a 19-year rhythm that aligns lunar months with solar years. Such knowledge demands long-term observation, careful record-keeping, and mathematical abstraction. These are not the tools of a society just discovering agriculture. They are the tools of a society refining an already mature scientific language. This reframes ancient Greece itself. The narrative we are taught presents Greek science as the origin point, the birthplace of rational inquiry. But the mechanism hints at inheritance. Greek engineers may not have invented this knowledge from nothing. They may have preserved, adapted, or miniaturized something far older. Ancient writers spoke of lost libraries, of knowledge brought from Egypt, from lands swallowed by time. Plato wrote of a civilization destroyed by catastrophe, remembered dimly as Atlantis. Such stories are often dismissed as allegory. Yet allegory has a habit of forming around trauma. People do not invent floods that erase the world without reason. The Antikythera mechanism suggests that before philosophy, before recorded history, someone had already mapped the sky with enough confidence to turn it into machinery. Gears become frozen equations. Rotations become time itself, captured in bronze. This also changes how we see ancient craftsmanship. Gears must mesh cleanly, their teeth must be cut at consistent angles, errors compound quickly, a single miscalculation ruins the entire system. This is engineering discipline, not improvisation. It implies standards, training, and shared technical language. The sea did not preserve this machine by accident. It preserved it because it was compact, self-contained, and made of materials chosen for durability. If larger systems once existed, built from wood, fiber, or less noble metals, they would not survive centuries underwater or buried in soil. Only fragments remain, and even those challenge us. The mechanism's purpose was not survival, it was understanding. To predict eclipses is to see danger coming. In ancient cultures, eclipses were feared, associated with disruption, divine anger, or catastrophe. To predict them removes fear. It replaces superstition with foresight. This is power of a quiet kind. When a society can predict the sky, it begins to think in cycles. Seasons, generations, rises and falls. Time ceases to be linear struggle and becomes patterned motion. This way of thinking aligns disturbingly well with other ancient evidence. Monuments aligned to solstices, temples oriented to stars, stone circles tracking precession over millennia. The Antikythera mechanism is not an outlier. It is a confirmation that ancient knowledge was not merely observational but analytical, not only poetic but mathematical, not only spiritual but mechanical. And like all complex systems, it was vulnerable. If catastrophe erased the infrastructure that supported such knowledge, if survivors scattered with fragments they barely understood, then what followed would look exactly like what we see. Isolated marvels, techniques remembered as myths, devices treated as curiosities rather than components. The mechanism does not explain itself. It does not declare who built it or why. It simply functions. It embodies a worldview where the universe can be modeled, predicted, and trusted to behave according to rules. That worldview did not vanish because it was wrong. It vanished because the people who held it did. What remains is a bronze echo, recovered from the sea, forcing us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that long before our modern age of science, humanity may have already reached for the gears of the cosmos, turned them, understood them, and then lost the hands that knew how to build them again. The Antikythera mechanism is not proof of ancient superiority. It is proof of ancient fragility. Knowledge can be astonishingly advanced and still perish, and if it has happened before, there is no guarantee it cannot happen again. Maps are promises. They claim that someone has seen what is drawn, measured it, understood its shape, and trusted it enough to fix it on a surface meant to last. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis presented a map drawn on gazelle skin, a fragment of a larger work that immediately looked unremarkable to the casual eye. Coastlines, compass roses, familiar seas. It appeared to be just another product of the age of exploration, a time when European ships fanned out across the oceans and slowly filled in the blank spaces of the world. For centuries, that is exactly how it was treated. Then the details began to speak. Piri Reis himself left notes in the margins, written with disarming honesty. He did not claim authorship in the modern sense. He described himself as a compiler, someone who gathered older sources and stitched them together. He cited more than 20 ancient maps, some inherited, some captured, some copied from documents that were already old when Columbus sailed west. A few, he claimed, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. This was not a map born in the 16th century. It was a descendant. The coastlines of Western Europe and Africa are strikingly accurate for their time, but it is South America that raises eyebrows. The eastern bulge of Brazil, the curve of the coastline, the placement of river mouths all display a precision that should have required long-term surveying. Longitude, the hardest coordinate to measure before modern clocks, appears unusually well resolved. This alone is puzzling, but it is not the real problem. At the bottom of the map lies a landmass that should not exist. Stretching eastward beneath South America is a long, curving coastline that historians long dismissed as a distorted rendering of Patagonia, awkwardly squeezed into leftover space. It was a convenient explanation, and for decades it went unchallenged. But convenience is not evidence, and when the map was examined using modern techniques, that explanation began to fail. When researchers overlaid Piri Reis's mysterious southern land onto modern seismic maps of Antarctica, something unsettling emerged. The contours matched. Not the ice-covered Antarctica we know today, but the bedrock coastline hidden beneath kilometers of ice. Bays, peninsulas, and inlets aligned with uncanny accuracy. This was not artistic imagination. It was cartography. Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. Its ice-free coastline has never been visible in recorded human history. Even today, we know its true shape only through radar and seismic imaging that can see through ice. Yet here it was, drawn centuries earlier on a map derived from sources far older still. Ice does not retreat quietly. According to geologists, the region depicted on the map was last ice-free more than 6,000 years ago, possibly much earlier. This places the original survey in a time when, according to conventional history, no civilization capable of global mapping should have existed. Humans were supposedly transitioning into agriculture, just beginning to build permanent settlements. They were not charting continents. Mapping the Earth accurately requires more than ships hugging coastlines. It requires an understanding of the planet as a sphere, methods to calculate latitude and longitude, instruments to track position over vast distances, and a system to compile and preserve data across generations. It requires a global perspective. The Piri Reis map implies exactly that. This is not an isolated case. Other ancient maps show similar anomalies, fragments of coastlines that only make sense when viewed through modern data. Again and again, the pattern repeats. Advanced knowledge appears without a clear developmental path, then disappears, leaving behind copies that degrade over time like photocopies of photocopies. If these maps are not hoaxes, and their material composition has been tested and confirmed, then their existence forces a re-evaluation of the ancient world. Someone, at some point, had the capability to survey the planet on a global scale. They knew the shape of continents long before those continents were supposedly discovered. They saw the world differently. This raises an uncomfortable implication. To map Antarctica's coastline, someone had to be there before it froze, or at least before ice buried its edges. This suggests a period when Earth's climate was dramatically different, and when humans, or something like them, were present and capable of exploration at a planetary level. The map does not tell us who these cartographers were. It does not name their ships or their cities. It simply preserves the result of their work. Knowledge without context, precision without explanation. Civilizations that build in stone leave ruins. Civilizations that map the world leave knowledge. When the former is destroyed by time or catastrophe, the latter can survive as copies, fragments, shadows embedded in later cultures that no longer understand their origin. The Piri Reis map feels like such a shadow. It also reframes exploration itself. The age of discovery may not have been an age of first contact, but an age of rediscovery. European sailors may have been retracing paths laid out in forgotten charts, following coastlines already known to someone else, long before their own flags touched the shore. This would explain the strange confidence of early navigators, their willingness to sail into supposedly unknown oceans with an assurance that feels almost inherited. Maps do not inspire courage unless they promise land. If a global civilization existed before the last major climatic upheaval, its collapse would have erased ports, ships, and cities. Sea levels rose, ice advanced, populations scattered. What survived would not be infrastructure, but information, copied and recopied until its origin faded into myth. The map is not just evidence of lost geography. It is evidence of lost memory. This memory appears elsewhere, in myths of a golden age, of a time before the flood, of a world destroyed and remade. Plato's Atlantis, often dismissed as fiction, reads less like fantasy and more like a distorted recollection of such a collapse. Not a single island, but a global system undone by catastrophe. The Piri Reis map does not scream this conclusion. It does not need to. Its quiet accuracy does the work. It sits in contradiction to our timelines, unbothered by our discomfort. If Antarctica was mapped before ice claimed it, then human history stretches further back than we admit. And if knowledge that advanced could be lost once, it can be lost again. The map is not a curiosity. It is a warning drawn in ink and skin, carried across centuries by hands that did not fully understand what they held. It tells us that the past is not as empty as we imagine, and that civilization may not be a straight ascent, but a fragile cycle, rising, falling, and leaving behind only fragments for the next world to puzzle over. Civilization is usually described as something that grows slowly, like a fire carefully tended over generations. First come tools, then villages, then cities, then knowledge. Yet again and again, the archaeological record shows a different pattern. Knowledge appears suddenly, fully formed, without the long trail of mistakes and experiments that should precede it. Nowhere is this contradiction more unsettling than in the myths humanity tells about its own beginnings. Across the ancient world, the earliest stories do not speak of people inventing civilization. They speak of being given civilization. Writing, agriculture, astronomy, architecture, law, medicine all arrive at once, delivered by figures who are never described as ordinary humans. These stories are usually dismissed as metaphor, but metaphors rarely agree across oceans. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians recorded their earliest memories on clay tablets baked hard by time. Among them appears Oannes, a being described as coming from the sea, wearing a fish-like cloak. He did not demand obedience or worship. He taught. He instructed humans in mathematics, geometry, writing, and construction, disciplines that require abstraction, memory, and systematized thought. The texts state clearly that before his arrival, people lived without order, without cities, without knowledge. This same pattern appears thousands of kilometers away. In the Andes, long before the Inca Empire, stories tell of Viracocha, a tall, bearded figure who emerged after a catastrophic flood. He taught people how to shape stone, how to align buildings with the heavens, how to organize society. Massive Andean structures, built from stones weighing tens or hundreds of tons, are attributed not to kings, but to the knowledge Viracocha brought. When his work was done, he walked into the ocean and disappeared. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs preserved the memory of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Despite the symbolic name, Quetzalcoatl was remembered as a man who arrived from across the sea, taught calendar systems, medicine, metallurgy, and ethics, and opposed human sacrifice. He left, promising to return. The expectation of his return was so deeply ingrained that centuries later it shaped real political decisions with catastrophic consequences. In Egypt, Thoth stands at the beginning of civilization as the giver of writing, measurement, geometry, astronomy, and law. He is not a creator god, but a recorder, a keeper of cosmic order. The Egyptians credited him with knowledge that already existed, knowledge he organized and delivered. These figures share too many traits to be coincidence. They arrive after catastrophe. They are associated with water. They bring complete systems of knowledge rather than incremental discoveries. They leave, and their teachings form the foundations of civilization wherever they appear. Physical descriptions deepen the unease. Beards are emphasized among cultures whose populations rarely grow them naturally. Light skin is noted where it would stand out visually. Clothing is described as long and unfamiliar. These are not abstract symbols of wisdom. They are remembered details. If these were simply gods invented to explain social development, their stories would diverge wildly. Instead, they converge. They behave less like deities and more like instructors operating under constraint, as if time were limited and the task urgent. This interpretation becomes more compelling when placed alongside physical evidence. Göbekli Tepe suggests advanced astronomical knowledge preserved by people who were not inventing it themselves. The pyramids encode planetary geometry beyond the needs of ritual burial. Andean stonework displays precision inconsistent with trial and error methods. The Antikythera mechanism compresses celestial mechanics into portable form. The Piri Reis map preserves global geography that should not have been known. These are not the products of isolated genius. They are fragments of a larger system. If a technologically and scientifically advanced civilization existed before the end of the last ice age, its collapse would have been swift and devastating. Rising seas would have swallowed coastal cities. Climate instability would have shattered agriculture. Survivors would have been scattered, stripped of infrastructure, forced to adapt quickly to a harsher world. In such a scenario, the transmission of knowledge becomes an act of survival. Those who retained understanding of astronomy, engineering, agriculture, and medicine would appear miraculous to scattered hunter-gatherer groups. Not because they were gods, but because context had vanished. A person who understands how to predict seasons controls food. A person who understands stone controls shelter. A person who understands the sky controls time. Authority would emerge naturally, grounded in knowledge rather than force. Over generations, memory degrades. Teachers become gods. Tools become miracles. Instruction becomes revelation. This is how history becomes myth, especially when writing itself is among the technologies lost and later reintroduced. The flood myths that accompany these teachers are nearly universal: water rising, fire falling from the sky, darkness, cold, a world destroyed and remade. Geology confirms abrupt climate shifts around 12,000 years ago. Meltwater pulses, sudden cooling, mass extinction. Human populations bottlenecked to survival. Myths do not preserve dates accurately. They preserve sequences. Disaster, survival, instruction, renewal. The teachers are always temporary. They do not establish dynasties. They do not remain to rule. Their disappearance suggests either death, dispersal, or deliberate withdrawal once their knowledge was seeded. The promise of return may reflect hope rather than certainty, a psychological anchor for cultures rebuilding from trauma. Warnings often accompany these stories. Knowledge is powerful. Misuse brings destruction. Fire from the sky. Weapons that burn cities. The previous world fell not only to nature, but to its own excess. These are not moral tales for children. They are cautionary messages passed through ritual because their original technical context was lost. Seen this way, mythology is not fiction. It is compressed memory, a corrupted archive preserving the outline of events when detail could not survive. Civilization, then, does not begin with invention. It begins with recovery. Humanity did not climb slowly out of ignorance once. It may have climbed, fallen, and climbed again, carrying scars it no longer recognizes. The figures we call gods may not have created humanity. They may have saved it, or at least tried to. And the knowledge they brought, scattered across the planet in stone, metal, and story, suggests a world before our own that reached heights we are only now beginning to approach again. If that world existed, its greatest legacy was not its machines, but its warning. That knowledge alone is not enough. That civilization is fragile, and that forgetting is far easier than remembering. Human beings have always looked upward, but history insists that true flight belonged to imagination until very recently. According to the standard narrative, the sky remained untouchable until engines, metallurgy, and modern physics converged in the 20th century. Everything before that is framed as myth, poetry, or spiritual metaphor. Yet when ancient texts speak of flight, they do so with a level of detail that strains the limits of symbolism. In the ancient Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, flying machines appear repeatedly, not as vague divine vehicles, but as engineered craft with structure, function, and limitation. These machines are called vimanas, and they are described with unsettling specificity. Some are spherical, others elongated like cigars. Some are capable of vertical ascent, others of long-distance travel across continents and oceans. They are not summoned by prayer. They are operated. The texts describe materials that are lightweight yet strong, metals combined in precise ratios, and internal mechanisms that produce lift and propulsion. Later, Sanskrit treatises, such as the Vaimanika Shastra, expand on these ideas, outlining principles of motion that rely on rotating energy systems and mercury-based engines. Mercury, described as both fluid and powerful, appears again and again as a central component. In modern terms, Mercury's behavior under rotation and heat is complex and dangerous, not something one stumbles upon casually. These descriptions are often dismissed as allegory, but allegory rarely includes technical constraints. The epics describe vimanas requiring maintenance, fuel, trained operators, and specific environmental conditions. They malfunction. They are damaged in combat. They are repaired. This is the language of machines, not miracles. Even more disturbing is the way aerial warfare is portrayed. Battles in the sky are not clashes of lightning bolts or divine wrath. They are tactical engagements, craft maneuver, pursue, evade, and deploy weapons with calculated intent. The sky becomes a theater of war governed by strategy rather than spectacle. At the center of these accounts lies a weapon called the Brahmastra. It is not a sword or a spear. It is a single projectile, unleashed once, with consequences that linger long after impact. The texts describe a blinding flash brighter than many suns, followed by a column of smoke and fire. Winds reverse direction. Water boils. Survivors suffer strange afflictions. Hair and nails fall out, skin burns without flame, food becomes poisoned. Animals flee or die where they stand. These are not poetic embellishments chosen at random. They align disturbingly well with the known effects of nuclear detonation and radiation exposure, phenomena humanity officially encountered only in the mid-20th century. Ancient authors had no precedent for such imagery, and yet they describe it with clinical precision. Archaeology adds an uncomfortable layer. In parts of India, vitrified stone has been found, fused as if exposed to extreme heat far beyond that of conventional fire. Similar vitrification appears at ancient sites in the Middle East and Europe, long before known industrial processes. Entire cities described in myth as destroyed by divine weapons show signs of sudden, intense heat. These findings are usually explained away as lightning strikes, meteor impacts, or later contamination. Each explanation works in isolation. Together they begin to feel strained. The epics do not frame these events as divine punishment. They frame them as the tragic misuse of knowledge. The Brahmastra is described as a weapon that should never be used lightly. Its deployment is followed by regret, horror, and irreversible consequence. This is not the tone of myth celebrating gods. It is the tone of survivors recording catastrophe. If these accounts preserve memory rather than fantasy, they imply something extraordinary. That a technologically advanced civilization existed long before recorded history. That it mastered flight. That it developed weapons capable of planetary-scale destruction, and that it destroyed itself. This interpretation aligns with earlier patterns. The flood myths, the sudden climatic collapse at the end of the last ice age, the disappearance of advanced knowledge, the arrival of teachers who warn against repeating past mistakes. Knowledge appears, reaches a peak, and is erased, leaving only distorted echoes in story and stone. Flight would have been the ultimate symbol of mastery. To leave the ground is to conquer gravity itself. If such a capability existed, it would reshape geography, trade, warfare, and perception of the world. It would also explain global similarities in myth. A flying civilization does not experience oceans as barriers. It experiences the planet as a single connected space. When that civilization fell, flight would become legend. Machines would become chariots of gods. Pilots would become divine beings. The sky would transform from a domain of travel into a realm of fear and reverence. This shift is visible in the myths themselves. Early accounts describe flight as functional. Later retellings turn it symbolic. Technology becomes theology as understanding fades. The same process happened with stonework, astronomy, and mapping. Precision dissolves into ritual. Instruction becomes worship. The epics also carry warnings forward. They emphasize restraint, balance, and moral responsibility. The knowledge to build and destroy is portrayed as neutral. It is human choice that determines outcome. This is not a lesson invented by primitive minds. It is the lesson learned by advanced ones too late. Modern civilization is uncomfortable with this idea because it undermines the belief in linear progress. It suggests that technological advancement does not guarantee survival, that intelligence does not protect against collapse, that reaching the sky once did not prevent a fall back to the ground. The notion that ancient flight existed does not require accepting every detail of the epics as literal. Memory degrades, stories warp. But memory also preserves structure. And the structure here is consistent. Machines, operators, energy systems, aerial conflict, catastrophic weapons, collapse. These are not random fantasies. They form a coherent narrative when placed alongside physical evidence of lost technologies and sudden global disruption. If flight was once achieved and lost, it explains the reverence ancient cultures held for the sky, not as an abstract heaven, but as a place once touched, once traveled, once filled with machines now gone. The sky becomes sacred not because it is unreachable, but because it was reached and then lost. This possibility reframes humanity's relationship with technology. It suggests we are not pioneers stepping into the unknown for the first time, but heirs retracing a dangerous path. The tools change, the materials improve, but the pattern remains. Knowledge rises, power follows, wisdom lags behind. The ancient stories of flight do not celebrate victory, they mourn consequence. They are not fantasies of escape, but records of warning. And if they are even partially true, then the greatest legacy of the lost world was not its ability to fly, but its attempt to tell us what happened when it did. We are not the first to reach upward. But we may still have the chance to be the first to remember why the last ones fell. There is a place on Earth where the ground itself becomes a message, stretched so wide that meaning only appears when distance is introduced. From the surface, the Nazca Desert in southern Peru looks empty, a vast plain of stone and dust scorched by sun and stripped of color. Nothing rises high enough to suggest intention. Nothing at eye level hints at design. It is only when elevation is gained, when the land is seen from above, that the silence breaks and structure emerges. Lines begin to form. Thousands of them. Some run straight for kilometers without deviation, cutting across hills and dry riverbeds as if the terrain did not exist. Others form precise geometric shapes, trapezoids, rectangles, spirals, corridors of cleared earth so wide and flat they resemble engineered surfaces rather than ritual paths. Then come the figures. A spider with unnatural proportions. A hummingbird frozen mid-flight. a monkey with a coiled tail. Shapes so large they cannot be recognized from the ground, only from the sky. The accepted explanation is tidy. The Nazca people, we are told, created these geoglyphs between the 1st and 7th centuries of the Common Era. They removed dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath, forming designs meant for ceremonial walking. The lines were ritual pathways. The figures were symbolic offerings to deities associated with water, fertility, and the mountains. The people made art they could never see, trusting that their gods were watching from above. The explanation sounds complete until scale and precision are allowed to matter. Many of the lines extend for several kilometers with no measurable curvature. Maintaining such straightness over uneven terrain requires surveying techniques, fixed reference points, and continuous correction. Even modern road construction relies on instruments to achieve this level of accuracy. Yet there is no evidence that the Nazca possessed elevated vantage points or tools capable of long-distance alignment beyond simple stakes and rope. The trapezoids raise further concern. These massive cleared areas are not decorative. They are flat, carefully leveled, and free of large stones. Some are hundreds of meters long and aligned with particular compass directions. They resemble runways more than walkways. Their width serves no ceremonial purpose for foot traffic. They are far too large, far too uniform, far too deliberate. The figures themselves add another layer. Many depict animals not native to the immediate region. The spider, the monkey, and certain birds are species associated with distant ecosystems. Their anatomical accuracy suggests careful observation rather than symbolic abstraction. These are not childlike representations. They are diagrams. Art, by its nature, demands an audience. A mural hidden behind a wall loses meaning. A sculpture buried underground fails its purpose. The Nazca figures were created at enormous cost of labor and time, yet were invisible to their makers in full form. This is not how human expression typically behaves, unless the audience was not human or not on the ground. When viewed from altitude, the desert transforms into something else entirely. The lines function like directional markers. The trapezoids resemble approach corridors. The geometric shapes appear as orientation references. The animal figures act as identifiers, massive symbols readable only from far above. The desert becomes legible not as art, but as infrastructure. If flight existed in the distant past, even in limited or rare form, a landscape-based navigation system would make sense. In a world without digital signals or artificial lighting, ground markings visible from the air would serve as guidance, alignment, and destination confirmation. Modern pilots rely on runways, beacons, and markings painted on the ground. The Nazca Desert contains all three, carved directly into the earth. Climate adds context. Geological evidence suggests that the region was not always as arid as it is today. Thousands of years ago, water flowed more freely. Vegetation existed where now there is stone. The desert's preservation of the lines is a consequence of later dryness, not original intention. What is now a barren expanse may once have been strategically isolated but environmentally viable. The location itself is telling. The Nazca lines are far from major population centers, both ancient and modern. This is not where one builds a temple meant for crowds. It is where one builds something that must remain clear, unobstructed, and stable. Much like modern test ranges or remote airfields, The scale of coordination required to create the Nazca complex also challenges the idea of spontaneous ritual art. The lines do not overlap randomly. They interact, intersect, and coexist without disrupting one another's integrity. This implies planning, a master layout, rules governing placement and orientation. Such order does not emerge accidentally over centuries of isolated ceremonies. The cultural memory surrounding the lines is surprisingly thin. Later, peoples in the region did not fully understand their purpose. They preserved them, respected them, but did not replicate them. This suggests that the knowledge required to create them had already been lost, even to those living nearby. The lines were inherited, not originated. This mirrors a broader pattern. Advanced structures built by one group are later revered by another that cannot reproduce them. The pyramids, Andean stonework, Göbekli Tepe. In each case, construction knowledge vanishes while the result endures. The Nazca Desert may represent the largest single expression of this phenomenon. Not a building, but a system. Not vertical, but horizontal. A message written on the skin of the planet itself. If the builders expected visitors from the sky, symbolism alone would not suffice. Clarity would be essential. Shapes must be unambiguous. Lines must be straight. Patterns must be recognizable at speed and altitude. The Nazca figures meet these requirements perfectly. This does not require the builders themselves to have flown. They may have been instructed. Knowledge passed down from those who had. The same pattern seen in myths of teachers appears here in stone and soil. Instructions given, systems built, understanding fades, structure remains. The most unsettling aspect of the Nazca lines is not their size or beauty, but their perspective. They assume height, they assume distance, they assume an observer who is not bound to the ground. When modern aircraft fly over the desert, pilots report an immediate sense of recognition. The lines make sense from above in a way they never do below. The land reveals itself as designed for that view. The Nazca Desert does not proclaim its purpose. It waits to be seen correctly. Like so many remnants of the ancient world, it resists the explanations that keep humanity comfortable with its timeline. It suggests that Earth was once navigated differently, that the sky was once a domain of movement rather than myth. If flight belonged to a forgotten age, the Nazca lines may be its most honest trace. Not a story retold and distorted, but a functional imprint, preserved by climate and chance. A map without words, a signal without sound. The desert does not care whether it is believed. It remains, lines unbroken, figures intact, waiting for a civilization capable of understanding that some messages were never meant to be read from the ground. Not all evidence of a forgotten world is carved into stone or stretched across deserts. Some of it is written, not in words we can read, but in symbols that refuse translation. These scripts exist on wood, stone, parchment, and clay, scattered across the planet like fragments of a shattered library. Each one is treated as an isolated mystery, a linguistic dead end. Taken together, they suggest something far more unsettling. On Easter Island, wooden tablets etched with elegant, repeating symbols are known as rongorongo. The glyphs are intricate, balanced, and rhythmic, arranged in lines that reverse direction with each row, a style known as reverse boustrophodon. This is not primitive scratching. It is a formal writing system. Yet the culture that produced it is said to have lived without metal tools, without draft animals, without large-scale architecture beyond stone statues whose construction is itself unexplained. Rongorongo has never been deciphered. No bilingual inscription exists. No clear evolutionary precursor has been found. The symbols do not resemble those of neighboring cultures. They appear fully formed, then vanish. When Europeans arrived, the knowledge of how to read them was already gone. In Crete, tablets written in Linear A tell a similar story. The script predates Greek civilization and was used by the Minoans, a culture advanced in engineering, trade, and art. Linear A is clearly a structured writing system, but its language remains unknown. Its successor, Linear B, was deciphered and revealed early Greek. Linear A did not evolve into Linear B. It was replaced. On the other side of the world, the Rohank Codex surfaced in Hungary, a manuscript of hundreds of pages written in a script containing over 200 unique characters. The text flows in a consistent direction, includes illustrations of cities, battles, and religious scenes, and appears to follow grammatical rules. Scholars have debated its origin for centuries, proposing everything from secret sects to elaborate hoaxes. None of the explanations fully account for its complexity or internal consistency. These are not random symbols. They are systems. They encode information according to rules that once made sense to someone. The question is not why we cannot read them, but why there are so many of them, all unconnected, all resistant to translation, all appearing in cultures that should not have been capable of inventing complex writing independently. The standard explanation is isolation. Each culture, we are told, developed its own script, then disappeared before it could spread or be preserved. This explanation works once. It strains under repetition. Writing systems are among the most conservative human inventions. They spread easily. They adapt. They leave descendants. The Latin alphabet evolved from Phoenician. Cuneiform influenced multiple languages across millennia. When a script works, it survives. When many scripts appear and vanish without descendants, something unusual is happening. What if these scripts were not local inventions at all? Consider the possibility that they are fragments of a much older global system of knowledge transmission, not a single language, but a shared symbolic framework adapted to local contexts. When the larger system collapsed, fragments remained, divorced from their original meaning, preserved as ritual, decoration, or sacred tradition, until even their custodians forgot how to read them. This would explain their complexity. It would explain their sudden appearance. It would explain why they resist comparison to known languages. They are not branches on the tree of human writing. They may be roots. Symbols do not have to represent spoken language. Modern mathematics, musical notation, and programming languages encode meaning without phonetics. A technical civilization might favor symbolic systems designed to convey instruction, data, or process, rather than speech. Such systems would look alien to linguists trained to expect grammar and vocabulary. Imagine a script designed to encode procedures rather than stories, diagrams rather than sentences, relationships rather than narration. Over time, without the context of its use, such a script would become indecipherable, even if every symbol were preserved perfectly. This possibility becomes more compelling when paired with other evidence. Acoustic stonework suggests knowledge of resonance. Ancient batteries suggest electrical experimentation, astronomical devices suggest advanced mathematics. Such technologies require documentation. Knowledge of this scale cannot survive purely through oral tradition. If a lost civilization documented its understanding symbolically, and if those documents were copied imperfectly by later cultures, the result would look exactly like what we see. Sacred scripts no one can read, revered texts whose meaning is assumed but never recovered. Even the way these scripts are treated supports this idea. Rongorongo tablets were considered sacred objects. Linear A tablets were stored in administrative contexts, suggesting record-keeping rather than poetry. The Rohonk Codex reads like a compendium, not a storybook. Modern scholars search these texts for prayers, myths, and historical records because that is what ancient writing usually contains. But if they are searching in the wrong category, translation will remain impossible. One does not translate an equation by looking for verbs. The fragmentation of these scripts also mirrors the fragmentation of physical technology. A gear without its machine, a battery without its circuit, a runway without aircraft. Writing without its knowledge system becomes decoration. This interpretation also reframes why so much ancient knowledge feels symbolic or ritualistic. When function is forgotten, form remains. Instructions become ceremonies. Technical diagrams become sacred art. Meaning collapses inward. The danger of such texts may also explain why some were hidden, buried, or restricted. Knowledge that once caused catastrophe would be treated carefully by survivors, not destroyed, but sealed away, encoded, fragmented, and guarded by tradition rather than understanding. The idea that ancient scripts may encode scientific or technical information rather than language is uncomfortable because it challenges the boundaries between science, myth, and history. It suggests that humanity once possessed a library larger than anything we have built since, and that we are wandering its ruins without knowing how to read the signs. These scripts are not proof on their own, but they rhyme with everything else: precision stone, impossible machines, global maps, astronomical monuments, teachers in myth. Each points to lost continuity. Writing is memory externalized. When writing becomes unreadable, memory becomes myth. Civilization forgets itself. The unanswered symbols scattered across the earth may not be failures of interpretation. They may be the last intact traces of a language that was never meant to be spoken aloud, a language of knowledge rather than conversation, a language whose silence is not accidental but inherited. If that is true, then humanity is not illiterate because the past is primitive. We are illiterate because the past was too advanced, and the key to understanding it was lost long before we arrived. The symbols wait, not because they want to be decoded, but because decoding them requires a way of thinking we have only just begun to rebuild. Sometimes the most disturbing evidence is not found in ruins or texts, but in bone. Human bone carries memory in a way stone never can. It records pressure, growth, adaptation, and intention. Scattered across museums and excavation sites around the world are skulls that do not fit comfortably within the standard narrative of human history. They are elongated, enlarged, and shaped in ways that immediately provoke dismissal. Cultural practice, scholars say. Artificial deformation. Aesthetic preference. Status symbolism. Case closed. Except the bones refuse to cooperate. Artificial cranial deformation is a real and well-documented practice. By binding an infant's head with cloth or wooden boards, soft cranial plates can be reshaped over time. The result is a stretched or flattened skull, altered in appearance but not in fundamental structure. Volume remains constant. Sutures remain present. Biology stays human. Yet a subset of elongated skulls, particularly those found in Paracas, Peru, violate these rules. The Paracas skulls are not merely elongated, they are larger. In some cases, their cranial volume exceeds that of a modern human by 25 to 50%. Their bone density differs. Their sutures are abnormal or absent. The sagittal suture, a seam that runs along the top of every Homo sapiens skull, is missing in several specimens. Artificial deformation cannot erase sutures. It can only reshape around them. These skulls are not isolated. Elongated skulls appear in ancient burials across the globe: Peru, Bolivia, Mexico, Egypt, Malta, the Caucasus, Siberia. Cultures separated by vast distances and millennia practiced head shaping on their elites. This alone is strange. Cultural fashions do not spontaneously arise identically in dozens of unconnected societies. The more unsettling question is imitation. Fashion always imitates something. Status symbols are derived from an ideal, a model that represents power, authority, or divinity. Crowns imitate the sun. Thrones imitate elevation. If elongated skulls were a mark of nobility, then nobility was copying a form already associated with superiority. Who had that form naturally? Ancient myths quietly answer this question. The civilizing teachers described across cultures are often depicted with tall, narrow heads. Gods are shown wearing headdresses that exaggerate cranial height. In Egypt, crowns stretch upward unnaturally. In Mesoamerica, deities are portrayed with elongated craniums hidden beneath ornate headgear. These are usually interpreted as symbolic, but symbolism does not arise in a vacuum. If the first bearers of advanced knowledge possessed naturally elongated skulls, later generations might attempt to replicate that appearance artificially, not for aesthetics, but for legitimacy. To look like the gods was to rule. To resemble the teachers was to inherit authority. This possibility becomes more troubling when genetics enters the picture. Limited DNA testing on some elongated skulls has produced controversial results, suggesting genetic markers not typical of known human populations. These findings are fiercely debated and often dismissed due to sample contamination or poor preservation. Yet the reluctance to pursue comprehensive analysis is itself telling. Some questions destabilize more than they enlighten. Even if the skulls represent a divergent human lineage rather than something non-human, their existence would still rewrite history. It would mean that Homo sapiens was not alone at the dawn of civilization. That other intelligent hominins may have survived longer than assumed, contributing knowledge before vanishing or being absorbed. But biology may not be the only factor. Function matters. The human brain is plastic. Its development is influenced by physical structure, blood flow, and pressure. Altering cranial shape during early growth could affect neural organization. This is not speculation. Modern neuroscience acknowledges that brain structure and function are intertwined. Pressure changes influence cognitive and sensory processing. Some ancient cultures believed that head shaping enhanced perception, intuition, or spiritual ability. These claims are dismissed as superstition, yet they align with a different way of thinking about cognition. If ancient technologies relied on resonance, sound, and vibration, then sensitivity to subtle frequencies would be valuable. A brain tuned differently might process information others cannot. This reframes cranial deformation not as decoration, but as attempted replication of a biological advantage. A crude method to approximate something that once existed naturally. The individuals with naturally elongated skulls, if they existed, would have appeared extraordinary. Larger brains, different skull architecture, possibly enhanced cognitive or perceptual capabilities. In a post-catastrophe world, they would stand apart, both physically and intellectually. Their authority would be unquestionable. As generations passed and their genetics diluted, their appearance would fade. Artificial deformation would become a ritualized attempt to preserve what biology could not. Over time, meaning would be lost, leaving only the practice. This pattern mirrors everything else. Knowledge becomes ritual. Technology becomes myth. Biology becomes symbol. The skulls are rarely discussed publicly. They sit in museum drawers, labeled, categorized, neutralized by explanation. But they resist being ordinary. They sit at the intersection of biology, culture, and memory. If a lost civilization existed, and if its leaders or specialists were biologically distinct, even slightly, it would explain why later societies revered them as gods. Intelligence, longevity, or sensory differences would appear supernatural to people stripped of context. The skulls also challenge the idea that humanity's past is uniform. They suggest diversity not just of culture, but of form, a complexity that modern narratives prefer to smooth away. This does not require extraterrestrial speculation. Earth has hosted multiple hominin species. Some overlapped, some interbred, some vanished. The possibility that one such group achieved a high level of knowledge before disappearing is not impossible. It is merely inconvenient. The elongated skulls do not prove this scenario, but like the stones, the maps, the machines, and the myths, they point in the same direction, toward a past that is not simple, toward a history that includes loss, forgetting, and deliberate suppression of uncomfortable anomalies. Bones do not lie. They do not exaggerate. They do not invent stories. They record what happened to them. And what these skulls record is deviation. From expectation. From narrative. From comfort. They suggest that the beings who shaped early civilization may not have looked exactly like us, and that those who came after tried desperately, painfully, to become like them again. If humanity is the inheritor of a fallen world, then these skulls may be its most intimate relics, not monuments to power, but echoes of a form of intelligence that once walked among us, taught us, and then disappeared, leaving behind only imitation and memory, etched into bone. There is a kind of knowledge that leaves no ruins, no machines, no broken tools for archaeology to recover. It leaves no stone blocks to measure and no metal to date. Instead, it leaves patterns in stories, shared experiences, and methods passed from mind to mind. Modern thinking treats such knowledge as primitive, unreliable, and symbolic. Yet this dismissal may hide one of the most sophisticated technologies of the ancient world. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, shamans describe the same journey. The details are so consistent they border on procedural. The initiate prepares through fasting, isolation, and ritual discipline. Sound plays a central role. Drums, chants, rattles, rhythms calibrated to alter perception. The body remains still while the mind enters motion. What follows is not described as imagination, but as travel. The accounts repeat. A tunnel or vortex, a sensation of acceleration, a transition into a realm governed by different rules. Entities are encountered not as ancestors or spirits of the dead, but as intelligences that feel external, autonomous, and instructional. Information is exchanged, not metaphorically, practically. Siberian shamans, Amazonian healers, Australian Aboriginal elders, and Tibetan mystics all describe this process using different cultural language, but the same underlying structure. These are not dreams. They are entered deliberately, exited deliberately, and used repeatedly for specific outcomes: healing, guidance, prediction, and instruction. The most unsettling aspect is not the experience itself, but the results. Knowledge acquired during these states often proves actionable. New medicinal plants, precise combinations of substances, astronomical insights, techniques for healing that work despite the absence of formal anatomy or chemistry. Nowhere is this more difficult to explain than in the Amazon rainforest. Among tens of thousands of plant species, indigenous tribes discovered a brew known as ayahuasca. It requires two primary components. One plant contains a powerful psychoactive compound that, on its own, is rendered inactive by the human digestive system. The other plant contains compounds that temporarily disable this biological filter, allowing the psychoactive agent to reach the brain. The odds of discovering this combination by random experimentation are effectively zero. Consuming the first plant alone does nothing. Consuming the second alone does nothing. Only together, in precise preparation, do they produce the effect. Indigenous shamans state clearly that this knowledge was not discovered through trial and error. They say the plants taught them. Modern science struggles with this claim because it challenges the assumption that knowledge must be externally observed. Yet when researchers analyze the experience neurologically, they find something unexpected. The brain does not enter a chaotic state. It enters a highly organized one. Neural networks synchronize. Information flow increases. Regions associated with sensory integration, memory, and pattern recognition light up in coordinated ways. This is not dysfunction. It is reconfiguration. If consciousness is treated not as a byproduct of the brain, but as an interface, these practices take on a different meaning. The brain becomes less like a generator and more like a receiver. Altering its chemistry, rhythm, or structure changes the channel, not the signal. Ancient cultures did not frame this as metaphor. They framed it as travel, as communication, as access. This possibility reframes ancient knowledge entirely. If advanced information could be accessed internally through trained states of consciousness, then libraries, instruments, and machines become secondary. Knowledge is not stored externally. It is retrieved. This would explain how sophisticated understanding could survive catastrophic collapse. When cities fall and tools are lost, internal methods remain. Songs, rhythms, rituals, protocols encoded in behavior rather than books. It would also explain why so much ancient knowledge appears sudden and complete. Agriculture, astronomy, medicine, and architecture emerge without long developmental trails. They may not have been invented locally. They may have been accessed. This also casts new light on cranial deformation practices. If altering skull shape affected brain resonance or blood flow, it could enhance sensitivity to altered states. a biological antenna, however crude, designed to tune the mind toward specific frequencies of experience. Sound reappears here as well. Chanting is not random. Drumming is not entertainment. Frequencies are chosen carefully, often matching brainwave patterns associated with deep focus or trance. Temples and caves amplify these sounds. Stone chambers resonate. The environment becomes part of the technology. What modern culture calls superstition begins to resemble a distributed operating system, one that uses biology, acoustics, chemistry, and ritual to access information beyond ordinary perception. This also explains the role of the shaman, not a priest, not a ruler, a specialist, someone trained to navigate a dangerous interface. These journeys are not without risk: psychological destabilization, physical harm, loss of identity. Cultures that practiced these methods developed strict rules, taboos, and safeguards. Not moral restrictions, but safety protocols. If such practices once supported an advanced civilization, their loss would be catastrophic. The collapse of internal access would sever a primary source of knowledge. Survivors would retain fragments without understanding, ritual without function, myth without mechanism. This pattern appears everywhere: sacred dances whose original purpose is unknown, chants preserved phonetically but no longer understood, initiation rites that continue long after their practical outcomes disappear. The modern world assumes that consciousness is subjective and unreliable. Ancient cultures treated it as a tool, a landscape to be explored, a source of information as real as stone or sky. This does not require accepting every vision as literal truth. It requires acknowledging that the human mind may be capable of more than sensory interpretation, that under certain conditions, it may access structures of information we do not yet understand. If a lost civilization mastered this internal technology, it would explain the coherence of ancient knowledge across vast distances. Minds trained similarly would retrieve similar information, regardless of geography. Knowledge would be global without requiring physical contact. It would also explain why this knowledge faded. Internal systems are fragile. They depend on training, continuity, and cultural support. Break the chain, and the system collapses completely. There are no blueprints to rediscover, no ruins to excavate, only stories that sound like fantasy to those who no longer have the key. The idea that ancient peoples accessed knowledge through consciousness is deeply unsettling because it undermines modern assumptions about intelligence and progress. It suggests that technological advancement is not only external, it is internal, and that we may have abandoned a powerful pathway in favor of tools we can hold rather than states we must become. If this is true, then the greatest loss of the ancient world was not its machines or cities. It was its understanding of the mind, a technology so subtle it left no ruins, only echoes. And those echoes remain, waiting in rituals still practiced, plants still growing, and minds still capable of being tuned if a civilization ever remembers how to listen again. There is a moment in every investigation when the evidence stops pointing outward and begins pointing inward. After stone, metal, map, myth, bone, and mind have each spoken, the remaining question is not what existed before us, but what remains of it within us. Civilization leaves artifacts, but it also leaves habits, ways of thinking, instincts that persist long after their original purpose is forgotten. Modern humanity prides itself on rationality, yet many of its deepest behaviors are inherited from a past it no longer remembers. We build cities along coastlines despite knowing they will flood. We extract energy faster than systems can replenish. We centralize knowledge into fragile digital forms, trusting permanence in media that can vanish with a pulse of electricity. These are not accidents. They are patterns. The ancient world appears to have understood something that modern culture resists acknowledging. Collapse is not an anomaly. It is a phase. The evidence suggests that previous civilizations did not fail because they lacked intelligence, but because they underestimated fragility. Complexity gave them power, but it also multiplied points of failure. What survives collapse is never what was most impressive. It is what was most adaptable. Stone survives fire. Story survives loss. Ritual survives language. These are not primitive forms. They are resilient ones. This is why ancient knowledge appears fragmented, not because it was incomplete, but because it was distributed across layers designed to survive different kinds of destruction. When cities burn, monuments remain. When monuments fall, stories persist. When stories distort, habits endure. Civilization collapses outward before it collapses inward. Modern thinking assumes that knowledge must be externalized to be preserved. Books, servers, archives. But ancient cultures appear to have treated memory as something that must be embodied. Songs encoded instruction. Myths encoded history. Ritual encoded procedure. These were not artistic choices. They were survival strategies. This also explains the strange emotional charge surrounding ancient sites. People report awe, disorientation, calm, or fear when entering certain chambers or landscapes. Acoustics shift perception. Geometry alters attention. These places were designed not only to be seen, but to be experienced. Experience imprints memory more deeply than information. The builders of these sites understood psychology long before it was named. They knew that to communicate across time, one must speak to the nervous system, not the intellect. A message that can be felt survives longer than one that must be understood. The modern world has largely abandoned this principle. Information is optimized for speed, not retention. Knowledge is stored externally, divorced from experience. When systems fail, memory goes with them. If a previous civilization collapsed despite its knowledge, it was not because it lacked data. It was because it failed to integrate wisdom into behavior. The same mistake is visible today. The danger is known. The consequences are modeled. The warnings are explicit. Behavior does not change. Ancient myths often describe a moment when humanity ignores guidance, when warnings are dismissed, when balance is lost. These stories are not moral scolding. They are pattern recognition. The recurrence of flood myths, fire from the sky, poisoned land, and broken seasons suggests that catastrophe was experienced, remembered, and transmitted deliberately. The fact that these stories survived at all implies intent. Someone wanted the future to know what happened, even if they could not explain it fully. What they could not preserve was context. Without context, warnings become superstition. Instructions become ritual. Technology becomes magic. This is not failure of transmission. It is the cost of survival. Modern humanity stands at a crossroads similar to the one implied by the ancient record. Energy abstraction has reached planetary scale. Information moves faster than understanding. Power concentrates while responsibility diffuses. Systems interlock so tightly that failure cascades instantly. The past suggests that this is not new. It suggests that humanity has stood here before, confident in its mastery, dismissive of old stories, convinced of its uniqueness. The ruins suggest otherwise. The most unsettling implication of the evidence is not that ancient civilizations were advanced, but that advancement did not save them. Knowledge alone did not prevent collapse. Technology did not guarantee continuity. What failed was memory integrated with restraint. This reframes progress. Advancement is not accumulation, it is balance. A civilization that cannot remember its own limits is not progressing. It is accelerating toward repetition. The artifacts of the ancient world do not ask to be admired. They do not demand belief. They persist quietly, waiting for recognition. Their message is not hidden. It is simply uncomfortable. Civilization is not a ladder. It is a cycle shaped by awareness. When awareness fades, collapse follows. When memory survives, recovery is possible. The evidence suggests that humanity inherited not just tools and techniques, but a warning, encoded imperfectly, preserved unevenly, but present. The question is not whether a lost civilization existed. The question is whether its fate will be understood before it is repeated. Stone can endure 10,000 years. Stories can endure longer. Behavior determines everything else. If the ancient world reached outward and fell, its final attempt may have been to reach forward, to speak across time using whatever mediums could survive disaster, to leave markers, to leave echoes. Those echoes are now loud enough to be heard, not because the past is speaking more clearly, but because the present is beginning to resemble it. Whether this cycle ends differently depends not on rediscovering lost technology, but on recognizing lost wisdom. The ancient world may have been advanced, but it was not invincible. Neither are we. The record is not a prophecy, it is a pattern, and patterns only repeat when they are ignored. When civilizations collapse, the first thing to vanish is confidence. The second is coordination. What remains is fear, followed by improvisation. The archaeological record of the deep past carries this signature clearly, not in chaos, but in sudden simplification. Complex systems disappear, monumental projects stop, writing fades, art becomes symbolic rather than technical. Humanity does not reset to zero, it retreats to what can be managed with certainty. The end of the last advanced age, whatever its name or scope, appears to have followed this pattern. The evidence does not suggest a slow decline, but an abrupt rupture. Climate shifted violently. Sea levels rose with terrifying speed. Entire coastlines vanished. Populations were displaced inland. Trade networks collapsed. Specialized knowledge died with its specialists. What followed was not ignorance, but survival. People who once navigated the globe were reduced to navigating seasons. Those who once tracked planetary cycles focused on rainfall. Those who once shaped stone with precision built shelters from what they could lift. This was not regression of intelligence. It was prioritization under pressure. The fragments of higher knowledge that survived did so unevenly. Astronomy lingered because the sky remained visible. Geometry survived because it was embedded in stone. Medicine persisted because bodies still suffered. But the systems that unified these domains vanished, leaving behind disconnected practices without shared explanation. This is why early post-collapse cultures appear contradictory. They display astonishing skill in one area and complete absence in another. perfect stonework alongside simple tools, advanced calendars alongside limited metallurgy. These are not signs of gradual development. They are signs of inheritance without context. Language itself fractured under this pressure. Without centralized education or stable transmission, words lost precision. Technical terms became symbolic. Instructions became metaphor. Over generations, the original meaning dissolved, leaving stories that sounded mythical but retained structure. This is how history becomes legend. In such conditions, authority shifts away from knowledge toward lineage, strength, or ritual legitimacy. Those who remember fragments of the old ways become shamans, priests, elders. Their power rests not in understanding, but in preservation. Change becomes dangerous. Innovation risks breaking what little stability remains. This explains the conservatism of many ancient cultures, the emphasis on tradition, the reverence for ancestors, the fear of deviation. These were not cultural quirks. They were adaptive responses to trauma. When the world has already ended once, caution becomes wisdom. The sealing of sites like Göbekli Tepe fits this pattern. Knowledge was not erased in panic. It was buried deliberately, as one might bury dangerous tools when children are present. The builders did not destroy their own work. They protected it from misuse, misunderstanding, or premature rediscovery. The same impulse appears in myth: forbidden knowledge, sacred fire, gifts that come with consequences. These stories are not anti-intellectual. They are post-catastrophic. They warn against repeating mistakes before the world is ready. Over time, as stability returned, populations grew. Agriculture spread. Settlements became permanent. Memory of the collapse faded. The caution encoded in ritual remained, but its reason was forgotten. Prohibitions became moral laws rather than safety measures. Gods replaced teachers. This transition marks the true beginning of what we call ancient history, not the dawn of civilization, but the dawn of forgetting. As generations passed, humans rebuilt complexity from scratch, unaware they were retracing old paths. Stone monuments were erected again, not with the same methods, but with reverence for those that already existed. Old structures were claimed by new cultures, their origins rewritten to fit emerging identities. The past was no longer a warning. It became a resource for legitimacy. This is why so many ancient civilizations claim divine ancestry. When knowledge arrives without explanation, divinity is the easiest frame. When technology cannot be replicated, gods fill the gap. When ruins outlast memory, myth takes ownership. The pattern is not deception. It is continuity under loss. What makes the present moment uniquely dangerous is not technology itself, but amnesia. Modern civilization has achieved levels of power comparable to what the ancient record implies, but without the inherited caution that followed collapse. The myths remain, but they are treated as entertainment. The warnings exist, but they are dismissed as superstition. The ancient survivors understood something fundamental. Complexity creates fragility. Systems that depend on constant energy, coordination, and specialization fail catastrophically when disrupted. Resilience lies in redundancy, simplicity, and distributed knowledge. Modern systems move in the opposite direction. Efficiency replaces redundancy. Speed replaces resilience. Knowledge concentrates into narrow expertise. Memory is externalized into systems that cannot survive interruption. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means collapse is predictable if patterns are ignored. The ancient world did not leave us instructions on how to avoid disaster. It left us evidence of what happens when warnings are not integrated into behavior. The difference matters. If humanity has fallen before, then survival the second time depends on recognition. Recognition that progress is not novelty. Recognition that intelligence without memory is repetition. Recognition that wisdom is not the accumulation of power, but the restraint of it. The ruins do not belong to a primitive past. They belong to a previous attempt at the same experiment humanity is running now. Different tools, same dynamics. Civilization does not fail because it lacks answers. It fails because it forgets questions that once mattered. The ancient survivors did not know who would come after them. They did not know what language would be spoken or what gods would be worshipped. They only knew that memory fades and patterns repeat. Their response was to embed reminders into the world itself. Stone aligned to stars, stories of fire and flood, rules without explanation. These were not meant to enlighten immediately. They were meant to endure. The fact that these signals are being noticed again suggests that humanity is approaching a familiar threshold. Not because the past is returning, but because the pattern is. The collapse of a civilization is not an ending. It is a transfer of responsibility. The ancient world carried knowledge forward as far as it could. What happens next depends on whether recognition arrives before repetition does. History does not move forward automatically. It moves in loops, tightened or widened by awareness. The past has already played its part. The rest belongs to those who can remember what forgetting costs. At some point, fragments stop behaving like fragments and begin behaving like a system. Stone alignments, lost machines, global myths, altered biology, symbolic scripts, and disciplined states of consciousness no longer feel unrelated once they are placed side by side. They interlock, not perfectly, but convincingly enough to suggest intention rather than coincidence. The ancient world begins to look less like a collection of primitive cultures and more like the aftermath of something integrated. Integration is the defining trait here. The evidence implies a civilization that did not separate knowledge into isolated categories. Astronomy was not distinct from architecture. Geometry was not divorced from spirituality. Biology, sound, consciousness, and environment were treated as aspects of the same underlying reality. This is why modern analysis struggles. We attempt to dissect what was designed to function as a whole. Modern civilization excels at specialization. Ancient civilization appears to have excelled at synthesis. This difference matters. A specialized system grows powerful quickly, but it becomes brittle. An integrated system grows slower, but it adapts. The ancient record suggests a society that prioritized harmony with natural cycles, resonance with planetary rhythms, and alignment with forces larger than itself. This is not mysticism. It is systems thinking without modern language. Such a civilization would not define progress by expansion alone. It would define it by balance. Energy use would be constrained by long-term consequence. Technology would be evaluated not only for efficiency, but for systemic impact. Knowledge would be distributed across forms to prevent catastrophic loss, yet even such a system would not be immune to collapse. Complexity always carries risk. External shocks amplify internal weaknesses. A comet fragment does not destroy a civilization directly. It destabilizes climate, food systems, and social trust. What follows is cascade. The ancient evidence suggests that cascade occurred. What is remarkable is not that collapse happened, but that recovery was attempted deliberately. Survivors did not rebuild the old world immediately. They adapted knowledge to reduced conditions. They simplified. They encoded rather than reconstructed. They taught caution rather than ambition. This restraint is visible everywhere. Monumental building slows, precision remains, but scale reduces. Knowledge is preserved symbolically rather than operationally. Myths replace manuals. Ritual replaces procedure. The goal shifts from progress to continuity. Modern culture misinterprets this as regression. It may have been strategy. If survivors understood that rapid redevelopment of advanced systems could repeat disaster, slowing down would be rational. Knowledge would be stored, not deployed. Passed on, not exploited. This would look like stagnation to later observers, but it would be intentional delay. This reframes the idea of a dark age. Darkness may not mean ignorance, it may mean restraint. Over time, restraint fades. Memory thins. The reasons for delay disappear. Curiosity returns without caution. The old sites are rediscovered without understanding. Power is reclaimed piecemeal. The cycle resumes. This is the pattern the ancient world appears to warn about, not through explicit instruction, but through omission. The technologies that could be most dangerous are the ones least clearly preserved. No blueprints for weapons. No manuals for large-scale energy manipulation. These are absent not because they never existed, but because they were not meant to survive intact. What survives instead are reminders of consequence. Floods, fire, skyborne destruction, poisoned land, broken cycles. These are repeated obsessively because they are the point. The ancient world doesn't glorify itself. It doesn't celebrate its achievements. It leaves no triumphant inscriptions declaring dominance. What it leaves behind feels cautious, even somber. Structures aligned to time. Stories weighted with loss. Practices emphasizing humility before forces beyond control. This tone is consistent across continents. It suggests shared experience, not shared imagination. The idea that humanity is unique in its technological moment is deeply comforting. It implies novelty, destiny, and exemption from past failure. The ancient record undermines this comfort. It suggests that intelligence is not rare, but wisdom is fragile. That the ability to build is common, but the ability to restrain is not. Modern civilization is approaching a level of integration that resembles what the ancient evidence implies. Global systems, planetary energy manipulation, information saturation, cognitive alteration through chemistry and technology. The parallels are difficult to ignore. The difference is not capability. It is memory. Ancient civilization appears to have collapsed once it lost balance between power and awareness. Its survivors tried to prevent repetition by encoding warning into culture itself. They did not expect to be remembered accurately. They expected to be misunderstood. Their goal was endurance, not clarity. That endurance worked, the fragments survived, the patterns persisted. The warnings remained embedded. What was missing was recognition. Recognition does not require belief in a single lost empire or a unified ancient state. It requires acknowledging that humanity's past includes peaks we no longer remember and failures we have not fully learned from. It requires humility toward evidence that does not fit linear narratives. The ancient world is not asking to be resurrected. It is asking to be understood. Its ruins are not blueprints, they are scars. Scars tell you where damage occurred. They do not tell you how to repeat the injury, but they do tell you where to be careful. Civilization today is skilled at repeating mistakes with improved tools, faster communication, greater energy, deeper reach. Without memory, improvement becomes acceleration. The ancient record offers a different metric for advancement. Not how much can be controlled, but how much can be balanced. Not how fast systems grow, but how gracefully they fail. Not how much power is achieved, but how responsibly it is held. These values are not nostalgic. They are adaptive. If humanity is to break the cycle rather than complete it, recognition must arrive before repetition. Not recognition of lost technology, but recognition of lost restraint. Not fascination with ancient feats, but understanding of ancient caution. The past does not demand obedience. It offers perspective. The fragments scattered across Earth have done their job. They endured, they waited, they aligned. What happens next is no longer a question of archaeology. It is a question of choice. As the fragments align, a different image of the ancient world takes shape, one that challenges not only history, but the assumptions guiding the present. The evidence suggests that the defining struggle of advanced civilization is not discovery, but restraint. Power accumulates faster than wisdom, and when the gap widens too far, collapse follows with mechanical inevitability. The ancient record implies that this lesson was learned the hard way. What distinguishes the remnants of the deep past is not triumph, but hesitation. The structures that survived are not declarations of dominance. They are quiet, measured, deliberate. Stone circles track time rather than territory. Monuments encode proportion rather than conquest. Myths emphasize consequence rather than glory. This is not how victorious civilizations speak. It is how chastened ones do. In a world rebuilt after catastrophe, caution becomes the highest form of intelligence. Survivors do not rush to recreate the systems that failed them. They simplify. They slow. They embed memory into culture rather than machinery. The ancient world appears to have made this choice consciously. This restraint is visible in what was not preserved. There are no clear blueprints for large-scale energy weapons. No surviving manuals for technologies capable of planetary harm. Instead, there are warnings disguised as stories. Fire from the sky. Land rendered barren. Knowledge that destroys when used without balance. These themes recur not because they are dramatic, but because they mattered. Modern culture often interprets this absence as lack. It may instead represent deliberate omission. The survivors of a fallen world would understand that certain knowledge cannot be safely inherited without context. To pass on power without wisdom is to guarantee repetition. The safest way to transmit such knowledge would be indirectly through ethics, ritual, and cautionary narrative. These forms slow access. They force interpretation. They resist misuse. This reframes the role of ancient priesthoods, initiations, and taboos. They are not arbitrary social controls. They are gatekeeping mechanisms designed to prevent premature interaction with forces that once proved catastrophic. Over time, as memory faded, these mechanisms remained while their purpose dissolved. What began as safety became superstition. The modern world has inverted this process. Access is prioritized, speed is celebrated, barriers are removed, knowledge is democratized without equivalent emphasis on integration or consequence. Capability expands faster than reflection. The ancient evidence suggests this imbalance is not new. Civilizations that reach a certain threshold face the same dilemma, whether to accelerate or to integrate. Acceleration promises dominance, integration demands patience. The former is seductive, the latter is difficult. The lost civilization implied by the evidence appears to have chosen acceleration at some point and paid the price. Its survivors chose integration instead. The fact that this choice did not prevent eventual forgetting does not negate its intent. Time erodes context. Symbols persist longer than explanations. Ritual outlives understanding. Eventually, restraint itself is forgotten, leaving only fragments that appear irrational to later generations. This is how cycles resume. Modern society often assumes that catastrophe will announce itself loudly. Fire, flood, impact. Yet the ancient record suggests collapse is usually quieter at first. Systems overextend. Feedback loops destabilize. Redundancy is eliminated in favor of efficiency. When disruption arrives, it propagates faster than response. The past does not depict apocalypse as punishment. It depicts it as consequence. The remnants scattered across the planet do not glorify collapse. They normalize it. They treat it as a phase in a recurring pattern rather than an exception. This perspective is unsettling because it removes the illusion of exemption. The belief that this time is different is the most consistent precursor to failure. Ancient cultures encoded humility into their worldview. Not submission to gods, but recognition of forces larger than human control. Climate, geology, time, consciousness itself. To act as if mastery were permanent was to invite correction. The modern world is rediscovering these forces through science, but often without the corresponding humility. Models replace memory. Prediction replaces restraint. Control replaces balance. The ancient record offers a different approach, not rejection of knowledge, but integration of consequence, not abandonment of power, but containment of it, not stagnation, but pacing. This is why ancient civilizations invested so heavily in long-term markers, structures aligned to cycles longer than political systems, calendars tracking epochs rather than reigns, stories spanning ages rather than lifetimes. These are not expressions of obsession. They are strategies for maintaining perspective. Perspective is the first casualty of acceleration. The evidence suggests that the ancient world attempted to preserve perspective after collapse by embedding it into culture itself. When technology failed, culture remained. When language shifted, symbols endured. When understanding faded, pattern survived. The fragments we inherit are not instructions for rebuilding a lost civilization. They are reminders of why rebuilding must be done differently. This distinction is critical. Rediscovering ancient techniques without rediscovering ancient restraint would be a failure to read the message. Fascination with lost power is easy. Absorbing lost wisdom is not. The ancient world does not ask to be imitated. It asks to be understood. Its silence on certain technologies is not ignorance. It is caution. Its emphasis on balance is not mysticism. It is systems awareness expressed through the tools available at the time. Civilization today stands in a familiar position, not because the past is repeating mechanically, but because the conditions are similar. Complexity has outpaced cohesion. Capability has outpaced consequence. Memory has been externalized and made fragile. The fragments left behind by earlier cycles are now intersecting with modern understanding. What once appeared mythic now appears patterned. What once seemed primitive now appears strategic. This convergence does not guarantee insight. Recognition does not automatically produce change. It merely offers the opportunity. The ancient world carried knowledge forward as best it could, knowing it would be distorted, misinterpreted, and incomplete. It trusted that pattern would survive even when clarity did not. That trust was not misplaced. The fragments have endured. The warnings remain legible. The question is no longer whether a lost civilization existed, but whether its final lesson will be understood. Power is easy to reclaim. Balance is not. The cycle does not end when technology advances. It ends when restraint becomes as valued as capability. That is the threshold the ancient world appears to have reached too late. Whether the present world reaches it in time remains unresolved. As the long arc of evidence settles into focus, the idea of a lost civilization stops feeling extraordinary and begins to feel almost inevitable. Not because humanity is uniquely gifted, but because intelligence, once it reaches a certain threshold, tends to explore the same paths: energy abstraction, environmental manipulation, cognitive expansion. Each step promises control, and each step quietly increases risk. The ancient world appears to have walked this path before, far enough to recognize where it ended. What remains striking is not the height of that earlier ascent, but the way its aftermath shaped everything that followed. The post-collapse world was not empty. It was populated by survivors carrying fragments of a shattered whole. These fragments did not reassemble neatly. They scattered, embedded themselves into different cultures, and took on different forms depending on local conditions. This scattering explains why ancient knowledge feels simultaneously universal and incomplete. Astronomy appears everywhere, but not with the same depth. Monumental architecture exists across continents, but techniques differ. Myths share structure, but not detail. Each culture preserved what it could, filtered through circumstance, environment, and memory. The result was not a continuation of the old world, but a patchwork echo of it. Over time, these echoes hardened into identity. Civilizations began to see themselves as origins rather than inheritors. The fragments they possessed felt complete because nothing else was visible. The gaps were filled with invention, belief, and assumption. Linear history took shape not because it was accurate, but because it was simpler to tell. This simplification is understandable. A story of steady progress reassures. It suggests purpose. It implies that the present is the culmination rather than another iteration. Cyclical history, by contrast, is unsettling. It suggests impermanence. It implies that collapse is not failure, but recurrence. The ancient world appears to have known this, and its final legacy may have been an attempt to soften the impact of recurrence rather than prevent it entirely. Collapse, once systems reach a certain level of complexity, may be unavoidable. What can be shaped is what survives it. Seen this way, the monuments, myths, and rituals of the ancient world function like lifeboats. They do not preserve everything. They preserve what matters most: timekeeping, moral restraint, environmental awareness, warnings about misuse of power. These are the minimum requirements for rebuilding without immediately repeating destruction. What was lost deliberately were the shortcuts, the tools that allow rapid accumulation of power without corresponding integration. The ancient silence around certain technologies becomes intelligible in this context. Absence is not ignorance. It is refusal. The modern world, in contrast, excels at recovering tools while neglecting context. We rediscover techniques quickly, but struggle to integrate consequence at the same pace. This imbalance is precisely what the ancient record seems to caution against. The final stages of a civilization are not marked by ignorance. They are marked by confidence, the belief that systems are stable, that safeguards are sufficient, that knowledge guarantees control. This confidence is visible in the ruins not as arrogance, but as quiet finality. Construction stops. Maintenance ceases, alignment remains. The silence of ancient sites is not emptiness, it is pause, a pause intended to stretch across generations. Modern humanity has shortened its pauses dramatically. Reflection is compressed. Decision cycles accelerate. Feedback arrives too late to matter. The ancient approach appears slower not because it lacked intelligence, but because it valued temporal distance as a form of insight. This difference in pacing may be the most important inheritance we have misunderstood. The evidence does not suggest that the ancient world failed because it did not know enough. It failed because knowing more did not automatically produce wiser action. The same tension defines the present. Data increases, understanding fragments, coordination lags. The fragments of the past do not offer solutions to modern problems. They offer perspective on the nature of problems themselves. They show that collapse is not sudden, it is cumulative, a series of small trade-offs that favor short-term gain over long-term balance. The ancient world encoded this understanding symbolically because symbols survive fragmentation. A story can cross cultures. A myth can outlast language. A monument can speak without words. These were not artistic flourishes. They were strategic choices. What we inherit is not a map of the past, but a diagnostic of the present. When stone aligns with stars, it says time matters. When myths repeat catastrophe, they say consequence matters. When knowledge is hidden behind ritual, it says restraint matters. These messages are consistent across continents because the problem they address is universal. The temptation is to romanticize the lost world, to imagine it as superior or enlightened. The evidence does not support this. It suggests a civilization capable of great insight and great error, advanced enough to understand its mistake, but not advanced enough to prevent it. That humility is its most valuable legacy. Modern civilization often frames itself as unprecedented. The ancient record quietly disagrees. It suggests that humanity's challenge is not reaching new heights, but learning how to remain there without destabilizing everything below. If the past teaches anything clearly, it is that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone. It requires memory integrated into behavior. It requires systems designed for failure, not just success. It requires respect for forces that do not negotiate. The fragments left behind are sufficient, not to rebuild the old world, but to recognize the pattern unfolding again. At some point, every civilization must decide whether it is building for expansion or endurance. The ancient world appears to have answered too late. Its survivors tried to delay repetition by embedding caution into culture. That effort carried forward imperfectly, but long enough to reach the present. The responsibility has now shifted. Whether humanity completes the cycle again or alters its shape depends not on rediscovering ancient power, but on absorbing ancient restraint. Not on proving the past wrong, but on recognizing where it was right. The ruins are finished speaking. What remains is how they are heard. At the far edge of this long inquiry, the past stops feeling distant. The accumulated weight of stone, story, symbol, and silence presses forward into the present, collapsing the illusion that ancient history is something finished and inert. What emerges instead is continuity, not a chain of events, but a recurring condition. Civilization is not a destination humanity reaches once. It is a state that must be maintained consciously, or it dissolves. The ancient world did not vanish without trace. It thinned, it fractured, it folded itself into the background of human behavior, where it continues to operate quietly. Its failures shaped instincts, its warnings shaped myth, its restraint shaped ritual, even its mistakes shaped ambition. Humanity did not start over. It adapted around loss. This is why modern civilization feels haunted by familiarity, the drive to extract energy faster than ecosystems can recover, the confidence that innovation will solve problems created by innovation, the faith that scale itself equals progress. These are not new impulses. They are resurfacing ones. The evidence examined throughout this journey does not point to a single catastrophic moment that erased a golden age. It points to a gradual crossing of thresholds. Each threshold felt manageable. Each trade-off felt justified. Only in retrospect did the pattern become visible. Collapse, in this sense, is not destruction. It is disintegration of coherence. When coherence fails, specialization turns into isolation. Knowledge stops flowing between domains. Systems optimize locally while destabilizing globally. Feedback arrives too late. Correction becomes impossible. The ancient record implies this process reached a tipping point long ago. What followed was not immediate darkness, but simplification. Humanity survived by shedding complexity, by narrowing focus, by prioritizing continuity over expansion. This phase is what modern history often labels primitive. It may have been intentional recovery. Recovery requires patience. Patience requires memory. Memory requires form that can survive disruption. This is why the ancient world chose stone, story, and cycle over text, machine, and speed. These forms are slow. They resist interpretation. They frustrate certainty, but they endure. Modern civilization has chosen the opposite: speed over durability, precision over resilience, access over integration. The trade-off is efficiency. The cost is fragility. The ancient record does not condemn this choice. It contextualizes it. It suggests that civilizations naturally favor acceleration once stability is achieved. The challenge is recognizing when acceleration becomes destabilizing. The ancient world appears to have recognized this too late. Its survivors tried to encode that recognition for the future, knowing it would be misunderstood. Knowing that warning cannot be delivered directly across millennia. Only pattern can. Pattern survives because it does not depend on belief. It reveals itself through repetition. The repetition is now visible. Global systems behave like ancient ones described in myth. Environmental feedback loops resemble stories of poisoned land and broken seasons. Technological power mirrors tales of fire from the sky. Information overload echoes ancient warnings about knowledge without wisdom. These parallels are not symbolic coincidences. They are structural similarities. The ancient world is not warning against technology. It is warning against imbalance. Balance is not stasis. It is dynamic adjustment. It requires constant attention to feedback, consequence, and limit. Ancient cultures encoded balance through cosmology because cosmology was the largest system they could observe. Aligning society with celestial cycles was a way of forcing long-term thinking into daily life. Modern society aligns itself with markets, metrics, and growth curves. These systems reward short-term gain. They obscure long-term consequence. They accelerate feedback loops until correction becomes disruptive rather than adaptive. The difference between these approaches is not intelligence. It is time horizon. The ancient world thought in epochs. The modern world thinks in quarters. This compression of time may be the most dangerous inheritance of all. It creates the illusion of control while eroding the capacity to respond. When systems fail under such compression, they fail everywhere at once. The fragments left behind by previous cycles are not nostalgic reminders of lost greatness. They are diagnostic tools. They show what happens when coherence collapses. They show what survives and what does not. They show that resilience is not built from dominance, but from integration. The ancient world integrated knowledge into behavior because behavior survives longer than information. Stories change how people act. Ritual changes how people feel. Architecture changes how people perceive. These are slow levers, but they are powerful. Modern civilization relies on explanation rather than integration. It assumes understanding will lead to action. The ancient record suggests otherwise. Understanding without embodiment fades quickly. Behavior shaped by structure endures. This does not mean the ancient world was wiser in every sense. It means it learned different lessons from failure. Lessons modern civilization has not yet fully absorbed. The question now is not whether humanity can rediscover lost technologies or decode ancient mysteries. Those pursuits may satisfy curiosity, but they miss the point. The point is whether humanity can recognize the pattern it is reenacting. Recognition does not require belief in a lost golden age. It requires humility toward evidence that challenges comfort. It requires willingness to see collapse not as anomaly, but as phase. And it requires commitment to building systems that can fail without ending everything. The ancient world failed to prevent its own collapse, but it succeeded in leaving a record. Not a record of how to build, but of how to lose. That record is intact. Civilization today stands not at the beginning of history, but at the edge of repetition. The past has already demonstrated what happens when power outruns memory. The future will demonstrate whether memory can outrun power. The ruins have done all they can do. They have endured. They have aligned. They have waited. What happens next is not written in stone. It is written in choice.